of the Open Badges MOOC. After a brief hiatus, we're raring to go and get back about our business, and we're pleased to have you back with us as well. We have some folks joining us from around the world, which is very exciting. Welcome to everybody. We're going to have a really, I think, wonderful presentation today, one I've been very much looking forward to. But before we get into that, I want to make just a few announcements. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Ann Derryberry. I'm one of the co-designers and instructors for this MOOC. And I want to let you know of some upcoming events that you might want to note in your calendar as well. On the 10th of November, we will be having another MOOC session, and the focus of that session will be on issues of policy, both institutional and governmental policy, as they relate to open badges. And on the 8th of December, we'll be kind of doing a year in review. There's been so much activity in the world of badges in this past year, so we want to make sure that you are up to date on as much of that as we can possibly fit into a 1-hour session. Again, that will be on the 8th of December. And then once we get into the new year, we're going to be doing a series of what we're calling Badges in Action sessions, so that we can hear from folks who are getting badge projects going or have badges in place within their institutions, and give us all a chance to sort of learn from each other in a kind of case study way. So we're starting to plan those now. We will be providing more information as we get closer to those dates. But if any of you is interested in sharing your badge project with our group, it's not too soon to let us know about it and to get your thinking caps on about how you might want to approach that. You can email either myself through the course site where all of our MOOC materials are, or Deb Everhart. We're the ones who are principally going to be organizing all of that stuff, so please let us know if you're interested. I also want to let you know that the challenge assignments are still active, and if any of you is interested in doing more work on challenge assignments, please feel free to do so. We are grading those and giving people feedback still at this point, so get involved if that's something that you'd like to pursue as well. And finally, before I turn the mic over to our presenter, I want to let you know that this presentation is scheduled to run for about 45 to 50 minutes. We will have a brief time for questions at the end, so if you have questions that you want to bring up, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. So with that, let me please happily introduce to you Dr. James Willis, who is at the Center for Research on Learning and Technology at Indiana University School of Education. He's going to be talking to us about a project that has been going on for a couple of years now, just been wrapping up there at IU, and the focus of that has been to look at a set of badge initiatives that launched a couple of years ago, and try to tease out the design principles that have come as a result of looking at those projects. So let me now please turn the mic over to James for his presentation. Thank you, James, for joining us today.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to meet all of you, and it's a pleasure to be able to start taking some of the results that we have and putting those out to the world. Again, so most of what I'm going to be talking about today are the Design Principles Documentation Project, and toward the end we'll be talking about a collaboration that we're doing with OpenEdX. So our research has been funded by the MacArthur Foundation, the Digital Media and Learning, and this has been an ongoing project of about 2 years, like Ann said. So within this, the Design Principles and Documentation Project, we've had 30 organizations that were awarded grants to develop badges in 2012 in the Badges for Lifelong Learning Initiative. So just to briefly introduce my collaborators and partners, Daniel Hickey is the PI for this project. We're working with Rebecca Ito, Katerina Shinka, Kathy Tran, Nate Otto, and Christine Chow as well. And again, bridging work with Hashtag and Mozilla Foundation. And this is an overview of some of the groups that we have worked with, of the different badges in the ecosystem that we're developing. And if you'll privilege me to be a geek for just a minute, what is really cool about this project is the fact that this has never been done before. This has never been, there's never been a way to be able to take all of these organizations and develop an ecosystem and award badges and see where it goes. So this is a very neat project, and we're just beginning to dig through the massive amount of data that we have, and I'm happy to be able to present that for the first time here today. So if you look at the first kind of this is the 30,000-foot view of who is involved in this. We have a great mix of participants from various different backgrounds, and this quickly shows that. Within the earners, about 30% are adults, and adults defined also as college students, vocational, and adult learners. And about 70% are students in elementary, middle, and high school. So the standards, about 35% or so are aligned to a common core, and about 30% are aligned to local standards. In the setting, about a third are in schools, roughly, and then we have a good mix of informal and extracurricular learners as well. Within the accreditation, about half are accredited and half are not, and some other as well. So again, this shows that we have a really good mix of data and participants. So kind of to set the context here, we have two quotes. The first by Carla Casilli, who many of you know. Regardless of where you start, it's likely you will end up somewhere other than your intended destination. That's okay. Systems are living things, and your system needs to be flexible. You need to embrace a bit of chaos in its design. So part of our project here is to be able to take the chaos, take the differences in culture, the differences in context, the differences in technology, and to be able to talk about those in a way that does embrace this chaos. And another quote by Philippe Cruchin: most of the knowledge generated when designing complex systems evaporates as features evolve and teams dissolve. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to capture that data before these features evolve and before the teams dissolve, and be able to say what worked, what didn't. So looking at some of the badge functions, we needed ways of being able to study the various different pieces of data that came out of the projects. We needed a way of being able to classify things. So just the general badge functions. These suggest fundamental ways that badges function in understanding badge practices through these categories, and they have implications for their design. For example, recognizing. We focus on decisions about the types of learning and achievement to recognize, the connections with existing credentials for this learning, and how learners interact with badges to unlock their value. With assessment, we have the practices, functions, and assessment types that directly impact the ways in which learners engage with the content. With motivation, we're looking at the hypothesized implications earning these badges that they have on earners' desire to learn, a desire to continue with the badge project, and the value for earning the badge. And then again, finally, studying learning. We're incorporating the research of how, for, and with digital badges, and we're disseminating these results widely. And part of what we're going to be talking about today is how and where we're disseminating these results. So the research team analyzed project proposals and then conducted interviews as projects got underway and after the development period was over. This resulted in forthcoming report in an open database detailing the intended practices, or the ideas outlined in general proposals, the enacted practices, or the intentions unfolding in the world, and formal practices, or what continues after the funding ends, for using digital badges, with particular attention on the factors that supported the formalization of some practices while hindering others. And again, these are kind of general ways of being able to categorize and make sense of the data that we have. So if we can look at some of the general findings, I think it's important at this point to make a note that what we're doing is we're pushing back against the notion of best practices as they're embodied in What Works clearinghouse at the Department of Education. And that's an important distinction here. What we're doing instead is that we're showing the promising practices. from the what seemed to work in particular context clearinghouse. This is an important distinction, and what's important here is that instead of saying, yes, this is a best practice, what we can do with this data is show this is what's promising. This is what seems to be the very best ways of embodying design principles and moving this forward. So some general findings, that digital badges are different than conventional credentials, that the badge itself can contain specific claims and detailed evidence of learning, that information can be linked to an unlimited amount of additional information, and some projects are not making claims and providing evidence. This last point was a particular problem for badge work with vets. They wanted to translate the skills from a service into skills for civilians. In the end, they had to hire a grad student to go in and do it manually, one skill at a time. Obviously, that's not scalable. Likewise, another project, SANFS, had a very ambitious plan to let students decide what evidence to include as evidence of competency, and this is a very hard thing to do. Microsoft also found this impossible, and so much so that they abandoned the entire open badge infrastructure. They just did away with it. As they put it, quote, "We sell products and we would have needed to hire an army of educators and assessors," end quote. So some organizations found this just to be so difficult that they couldn't make it work within an open OBI. So other general findings. That open digital badges are really different. This changes everything. There is a call for more transparency. There's credibility of claims and validity of evidence that gets crowdsourced. You have the reputation of the issuer becomes less important, and the credibility of claims and evidence becomes paramount. That's an important point, so I'm going to repeat it, that the reputation of the issuer becomes less important, and the credibility of claims and evidence becomes paramount. So some of the issues with this is that some folks had problems with FERPA. Many of you are probably familiar with FERPA, with protecting student information, but also COPPA, COPPA, which is the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act. So this is individuals who are under 18. And there were others that had concerns. In particular, this is a really big issue for Microsoft Partners in Learning. As a company and as a brand, they had concerns about the evidence and claims circulating in social networks. So again, when you're dealing with having privacy issues and having, who is a student and who is not, that sort of thing, this became an issue for some organizations. So as moving forward with the research, it's important to bear this in mind. So some general findings still, it's not just about the badges. That's an important point. The more successful projects integrated badge functions into their learning ecosystem. The less successful projects tried to build an ecosystem around badges. And some less successful projects gave badges redundantly or as an afterthought. So the ones that were the less successful were ones that just tried to give badges kind of as a one-off, or just as a, yeah, we'll just add that on. But the most successful projects already had a learning ecosystem that badges were integrated into. And that's, there's something to be said there about what makes sense, that you're able to build this in and have it run smoothly. Okay. So let's talk about some specific findings, and namely because we have a lot of really interesting data to talk about here. So badges really can work, but not everywhere. If you read the project Q&A at Haystack, most of the projects completed the Q&A that they've had to complete to get their final payment. Not surprisingly, most of the projects write about the lessons learned, but they don't necessarily highlight that many of the lessons seriously constrain their ability to build the proposed badges in the larger learning ecosystem around them. Our much more objective look allows us to be more complete. Depending on how you define success, ecosystem, and badges, here's what we concluded. 4 projects were suspended. 1 project is still trying. 7 projects have a partial finish, and 18 projects implemented. Our central goal was documenting what factors allowed some projects to get a badge ecosystem up and running in 2 years, and the factors that kept others from doing so. Some of the projects delayed their final interview as they tried to get things working, and in other cases we had a hard time tracking down anyone involved because the projects evaporated as both the project and the teams dissolved, taking lots of useful insights with them. So part of what we're trying to do here is be able to assess very cohesively and very entirely how these projects came together. So what we did in order to try to drill down into the data was start with Cheryl Grant's starting points. She calls them buckets. So she identified three very critical parts here: technology, content, and badges. So this helps illustrate the greater ecosystem here. The DPD project was very ethnographic. We were not allowed to help the projects. This was to keep us objective, but also to keep us from stepping on haystack toes, where Cheryl was in leading an effort to support the awardees. So having these particular pieces was very vital to how these are classified. So if you look up this particular reference, she talks about different types of builds. There are 5 different types of builds, and we'll talk about those for a minute. So in a new build, the badging system, learning content, and the technological platforms are designed simultaneously. The integrated build, the badge system and learning content are co-created and integrated into a pre-existing technological platform. In a layered build, the badge system is layered on top of pre-existing learning content and pre-existing technological platforms. In a responsive build, the badge system responds to pre-existing learning content and the technological platform does not yet exist, is optional, or is distributed. In a badge-first build, the badges are designed first and the learning content and technological platform are designed around the badges. So at this point, our project is really in a good position to be able to empirically study the starting point and then the success of the project. So what we've done is we've taken that which I just discussed as 5 different builds, and I've put it in a nice chart here to where we have the bucket and what it starts with and where it needs to build. So this is taking Cheryl's buckets and it's separating what is started, what you start with, and then what needs to be built in order to make those 3 things a complete part of the ecosystem. So we'll use that to be able to move this into discussing the data itself. So if we look at the implementation status by bucket, we have these color-coded, sort of like a stoplight. Red is not good, all the way up to green is very good. So let's look first at how we've defined these. More specifically, under pursuing, this is where they're still working on issuing badges, though no one is issuing them now. And suspended means they're no longer building, that they've run out of money or they simply stopped the program. So looking under the layered, and again, layered means that you start with technology and content, but you have to build the badges. You have 2 suspended, 2 partial, and 7 implemented. So overall, this is a pretty successful way of doing, starting with the technology and the content, but then building badges around it. If you look at the integrated, that's where you start with the technology, so like an LMS or something like that, and then you build the badges and the content into it. That's 1 partial, so that's not completely integrated yet. The responsive, this was probably by far, looking at it this way in terms of the buckets, one of the most successful. So you start with the content and then you build the badges and the technology around the content. So again, you're starting with the content and you're building the badges and the technology around it. We had 1 partial and we had 9 fully implemented. Under the new builds, and this means that you start with nothing, so you have to build the badges, the technology, and the content. But under Cheryl's definition, you build all 3 of those together simultaneously. This is where we had some mixed results. We had 1 suspended, 1 pursuing, 3 partial, and 1 fully implemented. So again, starting with nothing and building everything simultaneously, this is where you get sort of this very nuanced, very widespread results. Under the badges first, this is where you start with nothing and you build it all starting with the badges. So you build with badges first and then you build in the technology and the content. We had 1 suspended and 2 implemented. So looking at this, you can see where the responsive and layered are the most successful. And again, we have multiple different ways of looking at this. So the next one, again, color-coded the same way as the stoplight, is the implementation status by the earners. So if we look at this K through 12, And again, we have these kind of delineated out separately, even though obviously K-12 involves middle school and high school, but depending on the project, they had different definitions. So K-12, we had 1 suspended, 3 partial, and 2 implemented. Middle school, 2 partial, and 2 implemented. High school, again, spread out very similarly, 3 suspended, 2 partial, 7 implemented. Post-secondary, 1 pursuing and 2 implemented. And then the adults were all implemented. And we'll actually drill down a little bit deeper in just a few minutes talking about some of the adult results. Yet again, another way of looking at this is the badge status by the bucket. So proposed means that it's that these organizations went with the badges that they proposed. If they change them, we label those as different. So they created badges different than what they had proposed. They could have been that they went in and they found that what they were doing, what they were assessing, or what they were going to award a badge for just didn't match what they had originally thought they would, so they changed it up, is where we labeled it different. And none means that they didn't, that there were no badges that they proposed. So again, if we break this down into layered, and again, layered is starting with the technology and the content, and you build the badges. And there we had 1 that was none, 3 different, and 7 that fully gave the badge that they proposed. Integrated, this is where you start with the technology, but you build the badges and the content. There was none. So they didn't finish with the badge that they had proposed. The responsive build, and again, like the former slide that we looked at, the responsive and layered tended to be the most successful. Responsive is where you start with the content and then you build the badge and the tech. We had 3 that changed that were different, and we had 6 that built what they had proposed. Under the new build, and again, this is building all 3 components and building them simultaneously together, there were 2 that were different and 4 that proposed, but still ultimately successful. And under the badges first, we had 1 that was different. And this is where you start with nothing, but then when you start building, you build with the badge. Okay, and looking at the ecosystem, defining these again, when we talk about the ecosystem, if we say that it's proposed, it's what they had proposed as being an ecosystem. Different is different than what they had originally proposed. And none is what they didn't propose, and it changed or wasn't implemented at all. So if we look at the layered, layered is starting with the technology and the content and building in badges. We have some very nuanced results in the ecosystem. 3 none, 3 different, and 4 proposed. Integrated, again, not the best way of going about it, which is when you start with the technology and you build in the badges and the content. The responsive, this is where you start with the content and you build in the badges and the technology. Very mixed results along with layered, but still the most successful amongst them. 1 had none, 3 different, and 4 proposed. With the new build, this is where you start with nothing and you simultaneously build everything together. And we have 1 none, 2 different, and 3 proposed. And the badges first, which is where you start with nothing and you're building everything starting with the badges. We just had 1 none. So kind of a good way of looking at this to summarize is that the layered and responsive approach, let me go back to these badges. The layered, where we start with the technology and the content and build in the badges, and the responsive, where we start with the content and then build in the badges and the technology, tended to be the most successful. And again, this is across all the projects, so we're aggregating here. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about the adult learners. This is one component of the entire groups that we have been looking at. We'll look at YALSA, Who Built America, Microsoft Partners in Learning, Badges for Vet, UC Davis, and the Manufacturing Institute. So the first one, YALSA succeeded to implement most of their proposed practice, but then scaled them back. Who Built America significantly scaled back the scope of the project by dropping 1/3 of the proposed practices. So they had to alter what they were doing by 1/3. Microsoft Partners in Learning never managed to make their existing closed system OBI compliant, so they have badges in an ecosystem, but it's siloed. The Badge Work for Vets successfully built their badges, but the Veterans Affairs never endorsed or supported their project, and in the end they built a very successful ecosystem. They created a community for veterans. Even though other veteran groups did not cooperate, they provided a new service and community. UC Davis was an entirely new degree program and was very ambitious. They're still working to establish the program and the badges. The Manufacturing Institute succeeded in building the badges, but because of the chicken and the egg problem, the proposed ecosystem never emerged. So again, this is sort of a different way of looking at it with the build buckets. So where we have YALSA, Who Built America, etc., we have those in the build buckets that we have assigned them to in the project outcomes. I'll give you just a second to take a look at those. So we have some mixed results here, and this is what we're talking about with trying to push the envelope beyond best practices. A lot of this has to do with looking at the ecosystem, looking at the culture, looking at the programs and how they were structured. Okay, so what we're doing is we're now getting into some of the very specific data points, and we're looking specifically at one program here, YALSA. This is Young Adult Library Services Association. And we're looking at practices that were formalized or proposed and not enacted. So what's marked in red is what was proposed but not enacted. So we're going back to some of the early categories that I discussed at the beginning of the presentation, recognizing, assessing, and motivating. And we're aligning those with specific principles. Principles that we're able to apply across multiple different projects. And then we're looking at the practice, and we're looking at what was enacted. So YALSA was ultimately a successful ecosystem. This is remarkable because they actually had some very serious problems with the initial technology partner that they were paired with. But they had a modest set of intended practices. They were able to formalize all but one of these practices by scaling them back. In short, the peer mentorships providing privileges was designed as a meta badge by YALSA. Due to technological constraints from the platform that they were using, they were unable to administer any meta badges and therefore had to scrap this badge. In the follow-up, in the interview that we conducted, they did say that they wanted to informally carry out this practice, but there were no details about this. Okay, so looking at another specific one, this is Who Built America. So in red, we have where the principle and general practice was proposed and not enacted, and in green, this is where it was unproposed, but yet it was formalized. So again, recognizing, assessing, motivating, and studying badges. So like many projects, Who Built America found that many of their ambitious practices were unworkable. The peer assessments are always hard to do. They had enough foresight to realize that it wasn't the badge that they were after, it was the interaction. They have a badge called I Heart Community that is earned. They had intended a like feature that asked if this is valuable, now just posting to the forum a certain number of times. As for rubrics, they stopped using rubrics and more of the credential via the community. They dropped the Common Core rubric. The point system they had was actually a liking system where people could like each other's posts on Facebook. Just because it's easy to like things on Facebook, this does not mean it's easy to create the technology for the liking system. But then they also concluded that the non-competitive system that they came up with around the iHeart community seemed more effective. So WBA abandoned peer assessment for a number of reasons. This seems to be a bit of both. Due to platform constraints, WBA decided not to issue a peer-awarded badge or implement a liking system. They had a system in which other users could grade or downgrade teacher comments that were uploaded on their forums. Teachers or peers are required to participate in the community forums and offer resources and constructive criticism, but the community badges that they would get for this are only awarded for quantifiable traits like the number of posts on the forum. So teachers are also asked to respond to theory-related questions as opposed to known answer questions asked by the ASHP experts. While teachers can still deem another teacher's resource, insight, or constructive criticism helpful, no formal assessment or collaboration will be enacted at this point. Instead, WBA has shifted from a peer-awarded badge to an expert-awarded badges for participating in a community forum. The master history teachers are in the privilege to mentor teachers and evaluate their work, but WBA is still looking for ways to, for peers to award each other badges. I think it's also important to note that they have intended, enacted, and formalized the peer mentorship privilege. So while peer assessment is related to peer mentorship, WBA wanted to stick with having experts assess the responses on the community forums while peers could critique and give feedback on posts. So looking at badges for vets, in green is where practices have been unproposed but yet introduced, and in red is where they were proposed but not enacted. And again, we're trying to give a good flavor here of how complex the data set is. Complex from the interviews, complex from the data that we've gathered online, and to be able to reach across this and make generalizations. So Vets for Badges had a modest project that it was a good thing because the VA just wouldn't go for it. Apparently the VA doesn't want to support a project before it works. They wanted proof that badges worked before they would agree to participate. Other vet groups were very protective over their group of vets, so it got very little support. The key to their ecosystem is that they offered vets a kind of online community that they could not get anywhere. A bunch of vets with something in common, like trying to find jobs, found vets themselves that they could come together around. While this was not part of the original ecosystem, it became a very important feature of the site. And that happens in a lot of these instances, and we're trying to measure for those. They did manage the translation of skills, which makes it different from other projects. These are badges for things that they had already done, and all they had to do was post their skills, and then they hired a grad student to translate them. And as I discussed a little bit earlier on, it was very difficult to be able to scale up that system if one person is having to go through them. So this is the UC Davis results. These were practices that were proposed and not enacted. And there were a bit of issues here. So we had a bunch of these principles in the middle column, and these fit under recognizing, assessing, and motivating like the others. But then, when it comes to enacting with the general practice, there were some difficulties there. And just in case you're wondering, this presentation will be available afterward, so you can take a deeper dive into these results. So let's look at some of the principles and practices across the projects. And we want to look at first at the most challenging recognition principles and practices. So again, what we're going to talk about here is recognition, assessment, and motivation. So we'll look at those three separately. So external badging was a huge challenge. In some cases, the external partners did not want to play until they had proof that the badges worked. That certainly was the case for Who Built America. Who Built America intended for their badges to be endorsed by the National Council for Social Studies, National History Education Clearinghouse, and Stanford History Education Group to help ensure its recognition by people outside of the WBA community. But while obtaining endorsements is still part of the goal, this effort has been put aside as the project moves forward in its first launch. WBA would like to at least get outside the organizations to link to or inside the badge to give it more weight and generally help promote the professional development. Another example, SANFS still hasn't figured out how they're going to issue badges to externally communicate what's beyond the formal credential. And Who Built America tried to have experts issue badges, but they've had platform constraints. And then finally, standards. None of the adult projects had this problem, but generally speaking, the problem with standards is the project just didn't have the assessment capacity to generate the evidence needed to make those claims. So if we look specifically at the recognition here, and we have the practices, and we have outlined the number of failures to the number of attempts. Looking at the first one, like I mentioned, external backing is difficult to get, and in this case where 10 attempted it, 6 failed. We've included some of these others, and where it's externally valued, in 8 attempts, 6 of those failed. So switching over to assessment, 4 of the projects did not succeed, but that's because the project never got off the ground. So we can't conclude that this is a hard thing to do. They wanted experts that were so specialized that they could not get the system off the ground. They just did not do it. It was too ambitious. Standards couldn't just do it. So formal assessment is really difficult to accomplish. The projects got carried away with rubrics, and in the end it was too much work. So many projects focused on less challenging things. E-portfolios, for example, were very laborious, and too laborious for many. So it turns out that e-portfolios are really ambitious, and if you don't have experience with it, it's hard to make it happen. So it's particularly hard to foster conversation around them. Likewise, peer assessment is very similar to this. It's difficult to make it happen. Half of the projects that set out to provide peer assessment failed to formalize the practices for doing so. Many of the projects are giving peer feedback, but doing so outside of formal assessment. So the big takeaway here is that formal assessment is hard to do, and in some ways badges both push learning programs to do assessment, so there's evidence to put in the badges, but also makes it harder to do assessment. So by circulating that evidence in social networks and making the process transparent. And again, attempts and failures, we've outlined it the same way, so you can take a quick glance at those to see what was successful and what wasn't. And in the final, we'll look at motivation real quickly. Again, providing privileges is a principle, and out of the attempts to provide internships, 4 of the 6 attempts were failures. And this is important. It's kind of important to look at it in terms of what has failed versus what has succeeded. And just give you another quick glance, the use for different types of assessment. So where we looked at peer assessment and self-assessment and expert assessment, being able to build those in and kind of the difficulty of doing that in terms of failure and success. So if you'd like more information about this, what we're actually doing is compiling this data now, and we'll be uploading it to the existing website that we have. It's dpdproject.info. And what you can do here is take a look at the deep dive of information that we have, and we'll be updating this in the coming months. And we have a very deep dive and explanations for the various different projects that happened, some of the discussion of the various issues and successes and some of the difficulties with those. And we have taken this data, and we're in the process now of making sure that it fits within Shell Grants buckets and making sure that it fits within certain assessment principles so that we can make sense of this and so we can make some very robust claims about digital badges. So to quickly switch over, I'd like to talk about a project that we're currently underway with right now, and this is working with OpenEdX. And we're looking to use this as a platform to move beyond OpenEdX as well. So what we have paired with is a professor at George Washington University. Her name is Lorena Barba. She's teaching a MOOC called Practical Numerical Methods with Python. This is a fascinating MOOC, has a very high enrollment. Her graduate students that are on campus are also simultaneously enrolled in this MOOC. So what the CRLT, the group that I'm in, and Dan Hickey is the PI, what we're doing is we're providing 2 different things. We're providing a technological help as a bridge to help facilitate the coding in OpenEdX. And I'll talk about that more in just a minute. We're also helping with the pedagogy, so the purposeful implementation, evidence, and assessment that goes into badges. So within this particular MOOC, it was very early on in the collaboration that Dr. Barber realized that OpenEdX requires authentication. So having open badges within something that is not entirely open doesn't exactly work. So she proposed a solution that we think may be the first time that this has ever happened, is to link directly to GitHub. So what we're doing is we're using GitHub as being the repository for part of the evidence. So if a student is awarded a badge, they can link directly to GitHub to see that. Okay, so there are some very obvious challenges and opportunities here. Aligning these is the technical and pedagogical. So the technical end is that finding seams in the OpenEdX coding to build badges in an API connection is very difficult. I'm not a coder myself, but my understanding is that the code for OpenEdX is about 500,000 lines of Python. Again, that's 500,000 lines of Python. So finding those seams is very difficult. Also, another problem is assuring individual identity verification and management. Keeping open materials within the evidence of those outcomes. So being able to keep the data and make it in a way that we can share it across badges, but also making sure that it is authenticated. So pedagogically, we want to make sure that we're assessing the student progress and specific cumulative skills learned. We're in the process now of working with Dr. Barber to make sure that the units within the MOOC are made in a way that we can align badges with those. We also want to make this so that it's not just a one-off in this one MOOC. We want to make it so that badges will be able to be used in other Open edX forums and perhaps in edX, and then also build across in other providers. So we're looking at this as a, jump in, feet first, let's make a go of it, and then be able to expand this wider so that we can have badges in other platforms. So in order to be able to do this, in order to do it in a very short time frame, we had to have on-ground expertise and collaboration for this short-term solution, and to set the stage for the long-term issuance of badges. So the way that we did that is we've partnered with IBL Studios, and they are a premier organization that is recognized through Open edX that has an intimate knowledge of edX coding, and they're the ones that are going to be finding those seams in the Open edX platform. So where I referenced the 500,000 lines of Python, they're the ones that are going to find how to bridge that API in. And we're also working with Achievery, who has a commitment to Open Badges development, and we'll be using their API to link into Open edX. So it's working with these organizations to be able to do this and to be successful. So the short-term goal is to be able to issue badges by mid-November, and that's very ambitious. Obviously, this is the 20th of October, so we're talking less than a month. And we have been at it now for a while, for about a month, and this is a very ambitious plan. But the long-term goal is that by next spring, instructors in Open edX and edX will be able to seamlessly offer badges. Again, that is also very ambitious, but we are confident that we can do it. So much so that we're going to Cambridge next month in the Open edX conference to discuss this particular collaboration, some of the difficulties and some of the challenges and the opportunities that have come out of it, and working with several constituent groups in order to make this happen. Okay, so some future goals and ongoing and things that we are working on, from fully online courses to hybrid courses and standalone open modules. We want to facilitate the widespread use of digital badges in those contexts. So we're looking at this single platform in edX and Open edX and looking at other major platforms. So from unaccredited MOOCs to for-profit courses, co-curricular learning, faculty and staff learning, we are partnering with various different groups to help that happen. So from an email-based and informally verified badges to cryptographically signed and formally verified badges. So we're kind of moving with the badges ecosystem and trying to help spread that into higher education. And also from credentialing of isolated learning experiences to sophisticated dossiers with dramatic impact on college admission and employment. I think that I'm probably preaching to the choir here as far as badges go, but badges do change everything, and they do have the capacity to change education in the future. And we believe that by helping facilitate that into higher education, looking at the differences and the similarities between formal and informal learning, we'll be able to do that. And finally, we want to publish the findings. We want to publish the challenges and the collaboration notes and the future opportunities. This is working within specific contexts and specific groups, but we believe that it is possible in order to do that, to have these collaborative groups and to be able to publish widely and to be able to discuss the different things that went into it. So thank you for your time today. We have a few minutes to open this up to questions, and I will answer them as best as I can. I will preface and say that a lot of this is ongoing work, and we are in the we'll call it the research throes of going through a lot of very complex data. You all were the first to hear kind of the big picture stuff here, and especially getting into kind of the quantitative results and to take a deeper look at this. And this will be ongoing.
Well, thank you, James. What a great presentation. It was packed full of material, and there were a lot of good questions. So many good questions that it's kind of hard to figure out where to start. Here's a question from early on in terms of the success rates of the projects. Would you say that, particularly in the case of, for example, Microsoft, it's more a question of smart badge design or actually a question of feasibility?
That's a great question. And again, the issue here is not wanting to overgeneralize and not wanting to say, and that's part of the whole issue here with saying best practices versus promising practices. With Microsoft in particular, a lot of this is trying to recognize where an institution or someone that wants to award badges is in the makeup of the content and the technology that they have, and being able to build that in. And each one of these organizations has their own individual culture that has to be worked around. So, in terms of the individual success of Microsoft, I mean, they did have a lot of problems, and a lot of those had to do with reaching different levels of learners, different groups, and then being able to do this in an open way. It just wasn't working for them, and they had to change it. And that's kind of where it is. I mean, we've actually done some follow-up interviews with Microsoft recently, and it was just more of a case of, OBI just didn't work for us.
Well, I think that segues into another question that came up because, certainly the success of projects is going to be fairly, maybe completely dependent on project leaders' motivation and whether or not they really think that what they're doing is a good fit with what they're trying to accomplish. Did you have a chance to do any kind of analysis of project leaders' motivation?
We're still working on that. We're working on digging deeper into the motivational aspects, and we're going to be publishing those on the DPD website, talking about those specific things. We were able to say, with some confidence that where people started, and then the motivation that they put into it, so why they wanted to have badges, what was it going to do to help get their word out, what was it going to do to help their learners, really did kind of drive it. So I'll give you an example. So with 4-H has been issuing badges, the badges that they put on their sashes. I don't know, I wouldn't even know, 100 years maybe, something like this. They've been issuing badges for a very long time. They thought, well, why don't we do digital badges? Well, what ended up happening was that you had kids that were like, well, wait a minute, I'm not going to do 2 times the amount of work. I'm not going to do that. And then, it didn't work for them. So the motivation was there to be able to build in the badges, but what ended up happening was getting pushback of saying, well, do I want the badge that's going to go to the hash, or do I want the badge that's going to be digital? And the kids preferred the badge that was on the sash. So, it's one of those things where having to do a careful assessment of where an organization is and what they want to do with it, and then trying to figure out and make changes as appropriate.
Thanks. Here's a question about outcomes. So one of the recurring themes in discussion of badges has been granularity and the detail to which the outcomes can be measured. Was there variability in the degrees of granularity that the project aspired to, and did that have a bearing on success?
Great question. We are digging through those results now. That really is kind of the key piece to digital badges, is being able to demonstrate learning. Like everyone in this audience, I mean, we all have a transcript of some variety from a organization of learning. And that transcript says what I should be able to do, but how do I know that? And obviously, with a digital badge, you can go in, and the very best badges have these types of assessments built into them. I think a lot of it just has to do with the culture and the ecosystem that is involved, and a lot of it simply has to do with the planning what assessments are given and planning how those results are communicated through the badge, and building those intelligently in a way that they're open and accessible to those that can click on the badge and say, oh, well, so-and-so can do X, Y, and Z, and then show exactly what that means, and having these multiple layers of transparency and credibility that run through them.
Here's another question about outcomes. So did you have any projects that either implemented or considered backward design, where they started with the learning outcomes and then designed the rest of the project from there?
That is a fantastic question. I will actually need to go back and look at the data to be able to answer that specifically. So I won't venture an answer now, but I am happy to address those through email. Again, part of this is that we're just now publishing the top results of things that we're finding. So I would encourage folks, if you have these specific types of questions, you can direct them to me. I will put my email here in the chat. I don't want to give an incorrect answer and would rather take a look at the data.
Okay. If anybody wants to just go ahead and grab the mic to ask a question, that's fine too. There was a lot of back and forth in the forum about your comment about the reputation of the issuer becoming less important and the evidence and the achievements actually becoming more important. And it would be great if people who raised some of those points want to just speak up. That would be fine. I'll pause for a second and look for another question, see if anyone else speaks up. There's also a question that Dan answered partly, but maybe you want to comment on it too, in terms of being a little bit more specific in talking about the type of content that the project started with, and perhaps even how the quality or how well organized the content was impacted the success of the project?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this really kind of determines, again, I think a cultural way of looking at this is important. You know, I gave the example of 4-H and talking about how they had done physical badges for a very long time, and they thought it would be easy to build in digital badges with that, and it wasn't the case. Microsoft has done training and has had very robust training for many years, but yet had difficulties building in an open badge ecosystem to be able to facilitate that. So, I mean, a lot of it does depend on where an organization is beginning with the content that they have, and a lot of it depends on where they want to go with it. A lot of it depends on where they want to, the whole purpose of having the badge and facilitating, whether it's training, learning, informal learning, that sort of thing.
Yes. And Carolee, please.
So maybe it's been answered already, but were there some projects where they had a full-fledged portfolio platform before they started using badges?
A full portfolio.
As in learner portfolios, is that your question?
Yes, okay. Again, kind of sorting through the data in my head here. I believe that there were a couple that did have the portfolios built in already as part of the design. I'll have to go back and look for the very specifics of that. But I believe that they were successful in being able to build out badge systems from those.
And there was a kind of a cluster of discussion around next steps for the research. Mm-hmm. Do you want to say a bit more about where this is going?
Sure, yeah. So this is, as you can well imagine, just touching on some of the very high points, and we did do a big dive into, for example, the adult learning. There are these pieces that go through the other constituent groups, the K-12, middle school, high school, being able to break out this data in the same way. So where I showed the bar graphs, for example, you know, this is a way of trying to make sense of the aggregated data. And being able to assess this. So moving in the next couple months, we'll be putting together a comprehensive report that discusses these findings in the detail that is being asked in this case, and putting it out to the website and making it publicly available. And this is also, we're going to be publishing these results in peer review articles, and looking to be able to take what we have learned about design in badge ecosystems and being able to move it into the wider discussion, because we do have a lot of data, a lot of results, and we're in the process now of slicing and dicing the data in a lot of different ways. And the different categorizations that we talked about today are ways of being able to do that.
Great, thank you. I think actually that's probably an appropriate place to end. There was a lot of dialogue in the chat, and I'm not sure if I've captured everyone's questions or just kind of the general trends of the questions is what I did in some cases. So we'll pause for a moment to see if anybody else wants to take the mic to raise a question, and then we'll wrap.
And I'd like to give everyone that listened to the presentation a thank you. I know this is in the middle of the working day for most of you, and I'm very appreciative of your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a great presentation, and to you and Dan and others on the call who've been involved in this for a great body of work. This really advances the field. Thank you so much.
Thank you.